I think we met last time. Tell me your... Yeah.
Oh, hi, I'm Linda Almquist.
Linda Holmquist, huh?
Yes.
Uh-huh.
Yes, hi.
And which parish is yours?
I go to the Methodist Church.
Oh, yeah, you identified yourself. Yeah,
I've
yeah.
got one more with me today.
Ah,
My friend Deb over
yeah.
here.
Well, I'm doing this in Columbia Falls at the Methodist Church on Thursdays,
Oh, okay.
The Lutherans
in
and-
the afternoon,
over lunch hour,
lunchtime.
11:30 to 1.
People bring lunch or no?
Yeah. We had about 35 people here at the Methodist
Oh,
Church last week.
great.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm Jim Augustin.
Pastor Lucy. I was recently called the Eidsvold.
Ah, yes, I've heard. And your husband is Emmanuel, right? Yeah, we had lunch up there a couple weeks ago with BJ Carlson. Yeah, you may not have met her, but she goes here. We've known her for a long time, but she's a
Maybe so.
yeah. Okay. Welcome this evening to all of you. It's sort of like spring is sprung or has sprung or will shortly sprung. Gorgeous day. Yeah, I don't know about your household, but in our household, we always have a little tension this time of the year. Are we ready to put the plants out for good, or are we not? And go back and forth about all of that. But we did stop at Costco today and got the geraniums we want. And every spring we go out to Fisher's as soon as we get over here and put our name on some. And we'll have to go get those pretty soon, I think. Well, it's a delight to have you here. What I'd like to do today, this evening, is to start out with a few points that, in a fashion, summarize some of the things we talked about last time, for the sake of people who may not have been here, for the sake of all of us who need a refresher, whatever. And then we will move on. But before we do this, as some of you know, I'm doing this on Thursdays over the lunch hour at the Methodist Church in Columbia Falls. And last week, I think we had about 35 people there, and a gentleman handed this to me. If you are a New York Times reader, you will recognize the name David French. And he handed me this article, and the title, in a sense, says it all. The Christian right is dead. The religious right killed it. Okay? And Carol was kind enough to make a few copies of this. If anybody, I'll just leave them up here. And after, if you would like a copy of this, long story short, the religious right has little to do with Christianity. But it functions as a kind of religious reality, if not cult. And it has, according to David French, done in the Christian right. Well, we'll see. The other book, which I brought with me last week, and I have read, is the recent book by Jim Wallace, The False White Gospel. Now, some of you know about Jim Wallace and the Sojourners. community in Washington, D.C., and Jim Wallace grew up as an evangelical, and as he says, I think again in this book, he still identifies as an evangelical, much to his wife's chagrin. And if you know anything about his story, when he was at seminary, he began looking very seriously and with eyes wide open at the New Testament and the rest of the Bible for that matter. And he realized so much of the New Testament text, so much of the biblical text is devoted to justice, dealing with the stranger properly, and feeding the hungry. And the church has all too often gotten sidetracked in all sorts of other directions. And some of you who are members of Northridge will remember Hillary Dornan, who died very, I guess, tragically as a young woman from cancer, prematurely, certainly age-wise. She lived in the Sojourners community and worked there for a long time before, I think she came back to Kalispell, didn't she? Or yeah, she came back to Kalispell and then was involved in the Northridge community until her death. So, if you really want to think about white nationalism, you want to think about the so-called quote-unquote white gospel and the white gospel as a false gospel, Jim Wallace writes very accessibly and to the point. So, point number one, as by way of review. We're kind of struggling here, I think, in this group, but more broadly in the country, is to try to figure out the relationship between religion and politics. And, the Supreme Court is dealing with has dealt with these issues for a long, long time, is dealing with them presently, again and again and again, and Christian communities deal with this issue historically and present. And so, as I said in the description here, how is it, how does it work when extremist religion joins hands with extremist politics, and what kind of a toxic brew emerges out of that? Not to the benefit of either side, really. Second point. We talked a little bit about this enclave mentality, not only in this country, but globally. When you look at religious extremism or religious violence, if you will, this us and them kind of mentality. And those who sort of hunker down in their own enclave and see everybody on the outside, to put it mildly, as part of the problem. Not only politically, but religiously. I think, now let me rephrase it. I can't think of how many times I told undergraduate students that when it comes to these kinds of matters, religious matters, that is, that we're better off thinking that truth is not singular. And that doesn't mean I'm a relativist a relativist, but how do we live with our neighbors in our own communities or in the global community with those who believe and think religiously different than we do? We have neighbors in West Glacier who are from Pakistan. Grandma and Grandpa are here. They came Sunday visiting their little granddaughter, and, oh, by the way, their son and daughter-in-law too. And Grandpa and I today had a conversation about Kashmir, India, and Pakistan. And as he reminded me, there are something like 50 or 100 million Muslims in India, too. Goes back a long way. So the whole business of how we think about the state, how we think about religion, and maybe we're better off thinking it, at least in terms of some level of pluralism with regard to the questions of truth. Third point, religious enclaves often resist modern culture and life. I guess it was 2 days ago. I looked up a former colleague of mine who happens to be Pakistani American. A brilliant gentleman and elegant to the core. A practicing Muslim, but his interest was the intersection of religion and modernity. 2 PhDs, the whole bit. He stayed with us for about 5 years, and then he went, I think for family reasons, and now teaches in Lahore. I looked up his picture. He got gray, of course I didn't. Point 4, this... often, this is apocalyptic for people, too. There's a cosmic struggle going on here. And the righteous and the pure are the insiders, and everybody else is the outsiders. And that's not a new phenomenon. I had a colleague who taught at North Dakota State, and his interest was guns and religious violence. He loved guns too, by the way. And then, and I think, David, you brought this up. What about the leaders? That's tied up with the issue of authority and power. Most often they're men, and most often everybody sort of arranges themselves around this charismatic leader, and when the leader flames out, the community often fragments and disappears as well. There was another question that came up, and that had to do with why now is this making a resurgence, this kind of thing? Well, it's always been there, but there is a kind of resurgence of this struggle, I think. And I toy with this often. I think generally in this 21st century period that we're in, there is a great deal of confusion, instability, unsettledness, often driven by technology. But I need to qualify this just a bit. Technology drives a whole lot of things, from business to healthcare to every aspect, education, the military. And it's concrete, and the lines are direct. A doctor who's been in the field for very long has seen the appearance of new levels of imaging, robotics, robotic surgery, therapies and treatments and so on, like that. It's direct. All of that is true and is interesting, but what really interests me is what are the indirect social implications of all of this? We think about the Industrial Revolution largely in Britain in the 19th century, maybe the late 18th, I don't know, and these mills and looms and, women were working on the line and men were doing different things in the steam engine and so on and so forth. This is another one of those revolutionary periods, and I think it creates a kind of confusion, instability, and then maybe even a bit of a vacuum. And lo and behold, what fills that? There are some people who want to resist the future, turn it back to 1950. I've got a secret for you. We ain't going back. But we're not quite sure what is ahead of us either. So I'm not suggesting that technology and its implications are the only things at play here, but they do, I think, affect our sense of security, our sense of stability, our sense of whatever.
I appreciate you bringing that up as probably the youngest person here. My daughter's okay.
Yeah, well, you're a pair over there, right? Yeah.
Yes. I was having a conversation with my sister about stuff our mother has saved for us that is now outdated. And, we appreciate the intention of her saving, very specifically, homeschooling curriculum.
Mm-hmm.
We appreciate the intention of her saving it, but in the world she lived in, things did not update as quickly as it does now. So as young people, we are being constantly fed updates, and it creates an instability of we don't know what's going to change in the next 5 minutes.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
just kind of that
Yeah.
is the reality for so much of us who are
And you may or may not agree with this, but your point is about the updating, the change. That has been around for a long, long time.
Yeah.
But if Thomas Friedman is right, it's the pace. It is the pace. As he argues in his book, Thanks for Being Late. It's a pace question. So, it had a name, a person's name. When, microchips were being cranked out, and every 6 months the capacity could multiply by 2 or 3 or 4, whatever it is, in terms of the production of microchips. Well, it makes your head spin. If it's any consolation for you, my wife and I talk about that stuff that ought to be saved. Our kids don't care at all. In fact, they would probably throw us into the same bucket, archaic bucket. No, not really, but it isn't. We don't manifest the future. Okay, now I'm just going to, here's the danger of this. You spend all the time on review, you don't move on. If you would look, if you have that sheet with the outline, last time I think we more or less went through Roman numerals 1 and 2. If you will look at Roman numerals 3 and 4, it may not be obvious to you here, but the stories there kind of go together. Jerry Falwell and Greg Locke and the Global Vision Bible Church. Two figures who I think we could lump together under the heading of the kingdom builders. And today, now I would like to go on and start with Jerry Falwell and the moral majority. Save 2 or 3 of you in here, most of us can remember a whole lot about this. The rest of you who can't remember it because you were too young may have read about it. Tim Alberta spends a lot of time with Jerry Falwell Sr., Jerry Falwell Jr., and the moral majority, and the implications of this from the 70s into the 80s and on, and then Greg Locke from Tennessee. Okay, are we okay if we head down this winding path a little bit and think about this? Remember, I'm going to press on here. Raise your hand, interrupt me, whatever you need to do to make a point or ask a question or whatever. But Tim Alberta goes to Lynchburg, Virginia. And it is in Lynchburg, Virginia, that a Baptist preacher by the name of Jerry Falwell found himself, and after he grew up in a family that was largely atheistic. His dad was an alcoholic, and he was kind of lost, I think, in some ways, but he had a conversion experience. And this family of bootleggers and alcoholics and atheists brought Jerry Falwell into the world, and in 1952, 3 years after his father's death from cirrhosis of the liver, if you want to be precise, I guess you're a journalist, that's what you say, Jerry responded to an altar call and received Jesus as his Savior. In time when revivals were very common in many parts of the country, the young evangelist Billy Graham was hitting his stride and so on. He was drawing huge crowds. And eventually, Jerry Falwell decided he wouldn't go into business, but he went to Missouri Bible College and ultimately became a pastor. And this all happened under the tutelage of a fundamentalist segregationist preacher. Or maybe there was more than one. Fundamentalist segregationist. As Alberta describes him, Falwell was a people person. He was a schmoozer. He was a born salesman. And in 1956, he started his own church, the Thomas Road Baptist Church in Lynchburg, Virginia. And soon he was broadcasting his sermons on the relatively new medium in those days of TV, of course, which usually emphasized certain fundamentals of the faith. The virgin birth, the resurrection of Christ, the inerrancy of Scripture, and the substitutionary atonement of Christ's death. At this stage, according to Tim Alberta, Jerry Falwell was a separatist religion in the state. Hardcore separatist. The followers of Christ are distinct, and their heavenly home, or home is in heaven, and you have the state over here. He was a separationist. It was also at this time that Falwell saw an opportunity in higher education. And he started what in the beginning was Lynchburg Baptist College, which later became Liberty Baptist College, and ultimately Liberty University. Didn't they make it into the NCAA basketball tournament this year? And while in the early days it was certainly, as Tim Alberti describes it, a struggle to make this operation go. But but he made it clear that the goal of Liberty Baptist College or Liberty University was to train champions for Christ. In 1976, in the United States' bicentennial year, largely to raise money, Jerry Falwell Sr. embarked on a 112-location I Love America tour. He thought the college needed a national appeal, and what better way than a patriotic message to make this happen? He could see money or he could smell money, and he knew a certain kind of patriotism would sell well. In the Great Awakening tradition, there are at least two Great Awakenings in American history. Jerry Falwell in the 1970s thought there was an opportunity for a kind of fundamentalist reawakening of the American religious landscape, Christian landscape. And he and others set about to make this happen. Now, preachers who had preached total separation between worldly affairs and the state the church now began to turn toward the notion of a Christian civilization. And this Christian civilization they feared and would proclaim as something that was collapsing. And that Christians needed to resist this. The message clearly appealed to many older conservative Christian folks who also feared the total moral collapse of America and the fact that it was just around the corner. Urgency was needed. You might remember 1962. The Supreme Court case of Engel versus Vitale banned public sectarian prayer in the public schools. Well, of course, that meant all prayer was banned. Not quite so, but again, it would sell well. This too inflamed issues regarding curricular matters, such as evolution. We remember the Scopes trial, the monkey trial in Tennessee. Human sexuality, the science of the cosmos, evolution and Genesis or evolution, the whole bit. This, of course, as we know, gave rise to alternative schools and academies that were set up in some ways to protect, or it was perceived to protect, children from the evils of the world. A lot of this is pretty current too, right? Yeah, Kathy, Julie and I have a son-in-law who's retiring as a superintendent of schools, and he's had it because of those kinds of issues. Jerry Falwell, and this is sort of ironic timing-wise, hated Jimmy Carter. He hated Jimmy Carter. When I first wrote this, I had now 100 years old. He died this winter. You know, you might have differences with Jimmy Carter, but he would be a hard guy to hate, I would think. And he was, Jerry Falwell was intense about this. In particular, over the federal government's decision to deny tax-exempt status to Bob Jones University over its racially discriminatory practices. Okay? This supposedly set a precedent for Falwell and others who thought it would give secular politicians the right to shut down churches. We can sit here and we can think about this and think about the issue of masking during the pandemic. There were certain churches that were not going to follow the political figures and their advisories with regard to masking or not gathering in person because it might spread the thing. They were not going to do this. It seemed as though it was a governmental intrusion into something that was not just for the well-being of everybody, but the first step on the way of shutting churches down, perhaps. In other words, Christians needed to resist. Our American white Christian civilization was floundering on the brink of death. Apocalyptic language was the order of the day. Now, Jerry Falwell and some other kindred spirits, we might think of James Dobson, Donald Wildman, gathered, I assume it was in Lynchburg, they gathered to consider this dilemma, the collapse of civilization, the intrusion of the state as they saw it, and they formed what they called the moral majority. Now, Tim Alberta says they had a name, but they didn't have a mission yet, so they set about trying to come up with that too. As Alberta says, they turned to this issue of a mission. In 1973, the Supreme Court had handed down what? Roe versus Wade. The interesting thing up to this point, and Alberta makes this point as well, the evangelicals were not particularly anti-abortion to that point. The Catholics were out there, they had their thing, and they had their whole theology of life and all of that, but the evangelicals not so much. While the evangelicals were, as I say, not uniformly anti-abortion at the time, the movement to gin up anti-abortion support and turn it into a kind of example of secular hedonistic lifestyle was thought to signal the end and the collapse of Christian morality seemed to be the way to go. When all else fails, turn to sex and people's bedroom. It's dynamite. I don't know if you've ever read Ruth Bader Ginsburg on the decision, Roe versus Wade. But, and I remember reading this essay that she wrote reflecting back on it. She was opposed to it. I thought, oh, really? She wasn't opposed to the substance of it, but she thought the court was overreaching, and the direction of the country and the society was in that direction anyway. Let's just be patient. She feared it would create a backlash. Maybe she was right about that, huh?
Question.
Yes.
Are you saying that Falwell had this name, moral majority, and they created and developed the issue of
It so happened that you're in the same time frame as Roe versus Wade is coming. Well, let's latch on to that, and I am sure, how do I say this? We have the Catholics over here. Let's just leave them over here. They have their way of constructing this theologically. But the evangelical support for banning abortion, so on and so forth, was a concerted, was an explicit decision designed to gin up support for a particular kind of religiosity, theology, and engagement with or against the state. I don't know, we don't need to go down this very far, but since I heard it again, I think it was on public radio, which I've said to you many times before. Most of what I know in current affairs comes from public radio, as long as we have it. They gave another report from the Guttmacher Institute. Anybody familiar with the Guttmacher Institute? They track abortion issues. It's nonpartisan. They do the statistical analysis. Since the overturning of Roe versus Wade, abortions have not gone down. And they won't. So if you're really adamant and want to reduce the number of abortions, outlawing it isn't probably the route to go, because most abortions now are medically induced. And there are efforts to try to, what is it? What's the drug again? I forget. Mifepristone, yes, yeah, and it is to ban its passage through the United States Postal Service and so on and so forth. Yeah, good luck on that one. How have we done on keeping drugs out of this country, generally? So the issue is, this story is still going on. But you can see how, for many, it is another sign of a hedonistic American lifestyle that at best is secular and is at worst godless. Okay, the monetary benefits to Falwell, his church, and his college were enormous. But so was his political power and influence. He bought his own plane, made the rounds on the national news. Those of us who remember Larry King Live, he was on Larry King, and was plastered on the cover of Time magazine. The separationist instinct of the early Falwell was over. And some in his own orbit became uncomfortable with this, and they were sick and tired of the resulting circus and increasingly fanatical views of Jerry. They were tired of this God and country stuff overall. But he was a juggernaut. The lure of power and money seemed irresistible. In May 2007, Jerry Falwell Sr. died of a heart attack in his office at 73 years of age. After disbanding the Moral Majority in 1989, realizing that he had lost sight of his pastoral responsibilities, well, maybe he had, yeah, you can resonate to that. His national influence had dwindled only to be replaced by a new generation of culture warriors. He had started in that time, Jerry Falwell, the God Save America campaign in 1996 and launched a new radio program entitled Listen America. And a couple years later he did that. But his glory days were largely over. By the turn of the century, he was as much a punchline as a provocateur, largely reduced to mismanaging Liberty University and calling people names. You may remember that he referred to Ellen DeGeneres as Ellen Degenerate. Name calling is not new. It's clearly not new. It may be reprehensible, but it's not a new innovation. By 88, the Liberty University had almost gone under financially. His once formidable empire was deeply in debt, and he had no means to repay it. During these years now, Jerry Falwell Sr. has died, and Jerry Jr. steps up and, in effect, runs the university. He is a UVA, University of Virginia, law school graduate, and he had hoped for a career in real estate. He took the reins from his father, even though he had never had very much interest in the family business, let alone the university. Though he thought of himself as a Christian, he had no interest in the rules and regulations of fundamentalism. Throughout his life, he had chafed under the expectations of his father and the whole fundamentalist environment in which he was reared. Despite disavowing being a moral example, he was a good businessman and knew prior to his father's death that if his father's empire was to continue, if it was to survive, it would need to be pared back and put on a sound financial footing. Okay, you can understand that. After several years of financial austerity, the ship was righted. And after his father's death, he became de facto president of the university, while his brother Jonathan took over the pastoral duties of Thomas Road Baptist Church. The story of Jerry Jr.'s rise and eventual demise turns in some sense, according to Alberta, during the year 2016, with the emerging relationship between Jerry Jr. and Donald Trump. Long story short, Jerry Jr. became increasingly autocratic as president of the university, refusing to brook any dissent, any real dissent. As Alberta says, he seemed intent on testing the limits of his own invincibility. That should be a clue right away. In 2016, after Trump had secured the Republican nomination, Falwell journeyed to New York for a meeting of influential evangelical leaders, where he made clear he was no mere supporter of Donald Trump. He was going to be a pitchman for Donald Trump. He, along with Franklin Graham, the son of Billy Graham, vouched for Donald Trump's moral character and integrity. Okay. Falwell was ecstatic, recalling his father's alliance with Reagan and the way he had reshaped the American political landscape. On campus, Jerry Jr. cracked down on any serious criticism of Trump after he became president, and after the tragic Charlottesville debacle, he doubled down on his authoritarian instincts, refusing to allow the student newspaper to publish an article critical of Donald Trump's response to the Charlottesville event. Outwardly, however, the university appeared to be flourishing. Money flowed in, building continued apace. Whatever problems there were largely bubbled below the surface and were masked by the reputation of Jerry Jr. as a first-rate developer and fundraiser. But things would soon come crashing down. they would come crashing down on him and on the university. He published a picture of himself, this is Jerry Jr., a picture of himself on a donor's yacht with his arm around a pregnant young woman's midriff. University officials, seeing no alternative, placed him on temporary leave. A short time into his leave, he and his wife, Becky, issued a bizarre statement to a blogger for the Washington Examiner saying that she, Becky, had been carrying on an affair with a family friend. Not only damning in itself, perhaps, in that environment, this was in fact intended as damage control for the Reuters article that would come out the next day describing a three-way sexual affair with a pool boy in Miami. Watch out for those pool boys. The university painted, I suppose as a defensive gesture, painted Falwell as a rogue and forced him out as president. What followed at Liberty, however, was to reveal the rot that had set in the institution and how deeply it in fact ran. Falwell's departure revealed only the tip of the iceberg. Various people in the community came forward with allegations, and efforts to right the moral ship continue to this day, I think. Who knows where it goes from here? Just as an aside, I don't think I mentioned this. I mentioned this to somebody, but maybe it wasn't you. If I did, I say so much to so many different people I can't keep track of it all. When I started at Concordia in 1985, Billy Graham was coming to town for a crusade in Fargo, North Dakota. Did I tell you about this? Huh? No? Here I was, the junior guy in the department. No, I wasn't. There were two of us. There was a young woman whose father was Carl Albert, chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee. And our offices were right together here, but we got a call, the department got a call from public radio at the North Dakota State University, like somebody from the religion department at Concordia, Lutheran preferably, to come over and be on a talk show, answering questions and whatever, and talking about Billy Graham and his crusade sort of theology. And so the senior members of the department landed on me and said, "This is something you should do, Jim." I didn't know enough to, or have enough chutzpah to say no. I went over there, and I'll tell you this. I had a wonderful hour-long conversation with the interview, and not one person called. I thought, I'm not that provocative. I can't. But I was pleased about it, frankly, to talk about differences of theology and substance. You know, a decision theology and altar calls, and how do we think about it as Lutherans? And I thought we had a responsible conversation. But Billy Graham in those days was still crusading. Now, in this tortured Jerry Falwell senior and junior episode, we see many things, and most conspicuously, perhaps, is what happens when religious communities and institutions move from separatism to kingdom building. Move from an enclave mentality to God save the world with us as God's agents. Move from basic in this case Christian, humility to arrogant assertions of theological certainty and moral rectitude. Now, as we sit here tonight, the cardinals of the Roman Catholic Church are sitting in conclave. Some of you have seen the movie. I am told that black smoke has come up once. They've had one vote. Am I right? This afternoon, yeah, our time. Anyway, okay. But if you've seen the movie, you know that the dean of the conclave, now this is in the movie, says, right, I'm going to get the precise quote a little wrong, but the gist, certainty is the unforgivable sin. And he goes on in his opening homily to talk about doubt. It seems to me this Falwell episode shows how religious communities centered on a single individual, as charismatic as that individual may be, can easily become cult-like, and in the end, the process creates a situation that is inherently unstable as the leader exhibits his feet of clay and crashes in disgrace. Maybe you'll recognize this statement. I think I've heard it somewhere before. Pride and arrogance come before the fall. Cult leaders have shown over and over again what happens when they shut themselves off from critique, serious self-reflection, behaving when they sacrifice their integrity for power, and when they put themselves before basic human compassion. An unnamed gentleman has made the claim, apparently, I've seen it many, many different places, that the great flaw in Western civilization is Western civilizations exhibiting empathy.
Who is that?
There's something amiss there. And it's not a little something. If we don't have empathy, now this is me speaking, if we don't have empathy in significant measure, all the rest of it doesn't matter much. Okay? Jerry Falwell. What do you think? Ideas, questions, things you want to say?
Well, I was just thinking along with that technology comes, well, in the 1980s, the HIV and homosexuality in general and acceptance, and now trans and those issues have really scared the evangelicals.
The whole business of human sexuality, orientation, all these things.
If you need to finish about that.
I was just going to say, there was a gentleman in the group in Columbia Falls. I knew nothing. I don't know the individuals, and I didn't know what their kind of theological or political perspective would be, and or anything. Not that I had a particular expectation, but I didn't know. And the gentleman sitting there, and I wasn't even talking about human sexuality, I don't think, but he had this perplexed look on his face. An elderly gentleman. He said, you know, I cannot for the life of me figure out how it is that somebody may be gay or lesbian or trans or queer, whatever, diminishes me. And I thought, and so he said, I don't think I understand it. And I said, I don't think I do either. And then I went on to say, I knew more, I thought I knew everything that I needed to know about human sexuality when I was a 17-year-old white middle-class male. It was all pretty simple, right? And so, if you charted this on a graph over the next 60 years, you can do the math. I'm 77, actually. So, over the next 60 years, plotting my knowledge of human sexuality, it goes like this. I don't think I know much. But there is a obverse curve, or whatever the right term is. I have become increasingly convinced about how we ought to interact with our sisters and brothers and everybody of any orientation, and that has skyrocketed over those 60 years. I sometimes wonder what took me so long to figure that out, but at least the trajectory is in the right direction.
What do you have to say about the role of the media in this whole dynamic of political, religious, everything?
Yeah. Well, most of us here will remember when the evening news hour, whichever of the three broadcast networks, was where people most commonly gathered together and watched Walter Cronkite or, the others. And it wasn't necessarily jazzy. It wasn't always very investigative, but there was some reporting going on. Those of us who lived through the Vietnam War will know that was the first war that we could see. But remember, they had to take their film, fly it back to the United States, and put it on the evening news. So again, the speed and pace. But I think your comment or your question is far beyond that. It's the media ecosystem in which we live is just pulsating, throbbing 24/7 all the time. And there is no purity on the part of any of us who might want to escape it. You can't, it's like teenagers or college kids. Maybe you saw this at SBU, but when I first started there, I would get to the classroom a little bit before, waiting for the other class to get out, and students would be congregating and we'd all visit. Then the cell phones came, and the kids were all in their cell phones. They weren't visiting with me, but they might just be calling mom. Then it went to social media, and what people who were studying this were telling us is that students' social life is going on whether they're engaged and directly involved in it or not, and they have to check it to know. So I think it throbs in this.
Well, and the often chooses who to highlight and the spin they want to take on it.
Oh, exactly. And who or what the media wants to give attention to.
My assessment of the media is there's so many more outlets, and they're competing with each other. So they have to make these stories sensational sometimes, and or go after certain audiences.
Yeah. I read this winter, maybe end of winter. Are you familiar on MSNBC with Chris Hayes? His book, forget the precise title, but it deals with attention. And it's apparently among thinkers having to do with this. This is not a novel idea. What is it, the Siren Song or something like that, maybe? And attention, the ability to get attention and hold attention, is where the media ecosystem is out there. And then Mark Zuckerberg and his crew come together, and they learn how to monetize attention. If you're on Facebook, if you're on other social media, they're tracking you. The algorithm, Julie and I have very different opinions of social media, but she told me the other night, we bought new phones and got new cases and the whole thing. And she decided to get a case at Best Buy, I think, right? Mm-hmm. And she said, I'm getting all these ads for phone cases. And you think they're not tracking you? And they're selling it. They're selling it for people who are willing to pay because of the rewards they reap from the advertising.
The phones were free.
Oh, yeah, after $400. Yeah, they're free. And I've got a bridge to sell you, too. Steve, it would be nice. No, I don't think I could cope. But to just go to the wilderness somewhere and live in a little cabin. But I'm conditioned to receive information. My only rule is, you're not going to send it to me. I'm going to go to you looking for it. That means I can choose the sites where I go. The algorithm isn't going to push it to me. That's as self-righteous as I can get in this. Anything else?
A point that I want to make is that the role of fear in all of this, and that you can't raise money without scaring the daylights.
Yeah, fear. Mm-hmm.
And so it does seem to me that when I have a lot of connections with people pretty far to the right through relatives and so on, and it very quickly comes to light in a conversation that the government's after us. There's all kinds of very large fears that are there in the background all the time.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Yes, he said fear is in play virtually always in these kinds of things. And let's just kind of parse this a little bit. There are plenty of things just normally to be fearful about. Might be ill health, it can be this or that, or ill health of a family member. And there are legitimate, justifiable things that can create fear. But there are other levels of notions of fear, too, that can often be used to scare the bejabbers out of us and then kind of warp our way into their orbit, into the fearmonger orbit. And when we're afraid, it might, and on that level, it might be easier to manipulate us. Bev.
When Donald Trump was running the first time, someone asked him, where does power come from? And his answer was fear.
Okay, Bev said in 2016, the first time Donald Trump was running, was asked, where does power come from? And his answer was from fear. If you can scare people.
Yeah, he used it as extortion. I mean, that's how he gets his way.
So, just a second, David, here, okay?
And it seems like it becomes increasingly difficult to just, even with the social media and the quickness of it, to determine fact from fiction. You know, it's almost like we've lost our ability to independently investigate truth. You know, we don't know where to go. It goes even to our justice system. It used to be, you know, you're innocent until proven guilty. Now you're kind of guilty on the media. Good luck trying to prove you're innocent. I mean, it's just, everything has changed so much. So
Well, in this intense environment, I think that's true. You know, there's. So how do we realize that there is a pluralism of thought? Let's say on religion, for example, there is kind of pluralism, and on the one hand, affirm that. And on the other hand, not become an absolute relativist where anything and everything goes, which, in my view, is just another way of allowing the authoritarians to creep in the back door. And then it becomes a question of who has the most power. It isn't a question of argumentation, truth, fact, or knowledge. It's, I've got more power than you do.
Well, so on one level, we have the power and the leadership directing the traffic of their constituency. They're making the money off it. What does it say about the followers?
Okay, if you weren't able to hear David, we can talk about the leadership of the nation or of a group or society, whatever. They have the power, they have the means to manipulate and to make the money. And he asks the question, then what does it mean about the followers? What does it mean about the followers? Yes.
I say that because I have a very good friend of mine who's absolutely convinced I'm going to hell. Because I'm not his type of Christian.
Yeah.
I mean, I get there, and I can work on it. But so we have two different views of Christianity.
Yeah, and again, having different views of Christianity or virtually any other major religion is not a new phenomenon.
Just wait, let God sort it out.
Yeah. But there, it comes back again, I think, in this confusing world we live in, and where we have neighbors who have different skin color, have different ethnic backgrounds, have different religious traditions, and so on and so forth. Now, the question for me is not just how we're going to coexist, but how are we going to genuinely and seriously interact and be respectful of each other. I'm not one who thinks what we ought to do is boil down all religions and come up with some sort of steam and vapor or something, and we'd be okay. I like the particularity of religion. We don't want to remove difference. We want to learn how to express and live difference. And yes.
I think this is coming close to something that I've been trying to figure out how to formulate, and I appreciate what you're saying, which is, I often have the feeling that as the world changes, as we become what outside of the United States is what people are now calling the majority world, there are more people of all kinds of colors than there are of people who are white. Only white. It's just a fact. It's a fact. It's a reality, and to me, it's a beautiful reality. I think what is happening, people are afraid of it, and okay, that's all right too. Maybe you're afraid of it. Maybe you need to step out a little bit and enjoy it, and then come back. But what seems to be happening is the thought that if only I had enough guns, I would not have to face that. I could make that not happen anymore.
Yeah.
And it's such a natural phenomenon that it's impossible. It's like holding back the ocean. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think you're exactly right there about that. So the posture is, if your posture is to resist change that you see all around you, well, good luck. Or if you try to figure out how to adapt and embrace, and that requires some self-reflection about yourself and your own commitments, it seems to me. And I don't want to reduce everything down to an either-or choice here, but it seems to me if I am going to choose one or the other of those, I know where I'm going. And that's why I say I think it's important to be able, in these kinds of matters, to think about the pluralism of truth. If it's singular, I think John thinks this way, Kathy thinks this way, and oh, heavens to Daisy, David thinks that way, and I think something else. If it's singular, at least three of us have to be wrong. Right. I'm not so sure about that. And at least, my notion of God is a little bit bigger than that.
Well, what I see missing is civility. We can't have a civil conversation with our neighbor.
Especially online.
Oh.
The ethic is very different there. I can remember I subscribed to a couple of, in the early days of the internet, before social media as such, but there would be listservs among academics. And they would go after each other, tooth, tongue, and toenail. And I thought, I don't need this. And I knew some of them. They weren't bad people, but they were in a medium where there was no apparent inhibition.
I have a second cousin here in town, and she is MAGA. And in our periodic visiting, she wants answers, and she doesn't want to have to work through those answers. Just tell me what I'm supposed to think, how I'm supposed to go about it.
Mm-hmm.
And we're trying to do some family history, and it's profoundly colored her ability to work through other things.
Yeah, and I think it can be hard work, admittedly, but I think that kind of comes back to the reality if there's a kind of a confusing social world, it exacerbates that sense of wanting to cling to something that's black or white and not have to struggle with uncertainty.
I think it also has to do with not necessarily embracing what you don't know or embracing what feels threatening, but having a basic curiosity and a basic, instead of always defaulting to suspicion or judgment, to honestly want to know more about why John thinks this, Kathy thinks that, and somebody else thinks this.
Yeah,
And then engaging in conversation, but remaining open because you're curious.
Mm-hmm. The privilege of the chair here, I am going, because we have about 12 minutes left, I want to get started on Greg Locke. We're at the point in this series where agenda anxiety starts to take over for me a little bit. Greg Locke, the Global Vision Bible Church, the Kingdom Builders. Greg Locke is a more recent version of this. So we move from Lynchburg, Virginia, to Mount Juliet, Tennessee. Greg Locke and the Global Vision Bible Church. And if I can kind of push through some of this, then the second half of this is where it gets really interesting. At the summit of a mountain in Wilson County, Tennessee, stands a large tent and a sign out front that during the pandemic read, "This is a mask-free church." Inside, as Alberta describes it, were guards, many of whom were armed, wearing camo, ostensibly protecting the large tent gathering. Greg Locke saluted those gathered as soldiers rising up in God's army. You may have read in the Atlantic an article on God's army. You may have seen some clips on the news about God's army as well. They're not just in Tennessee. As these people ecstatically jumped up and down, while most evangelicals, according to Alberta, would not see themselves as part of this Christian demographic. For Greg Locke had suggested that autistic children were demon-possessed, and he had supported a book burning to destroy Harry Potter's words. And once he referred to President Biden, and I quote from Alberta, as a sex trafficking demon-possessed mongrel. You might disagree with Joe Biden's policies, but it's a little hard for me to imagine how you get to this. I think I need to repeat, most American evangelical Christians would not see themselves in the Greg Locke Global Vision Bible Church camp. As one pastor warned Tim Alberta before he visited the church, this is downright dangerous. As Alberta reflects, yes, strange indeed, but relative to what? He'd been in a lot of strange places. After what he had seen and heard about militarism and imminent Armageddon, let alone churches that hosted election deniers, speakers denouncing the satanic Black Lives Matter movement, the churches that see themselves as mainstream all seem rather whole old hat, says Alberta. The so-called church spectacles that seem all too common now would have stunned previous generations of churchgoers. Now, can you imagine why a lot of young people in this country don't want to have anything to do with this? Now, I think you ought to think more seriously about it, but at first blush, what could have happened to the American spiritual ecosystem, especially parts of the evangelical wing of it? Alberta asks. Greg Locke began to cast himself as a lone voice of Christian courage, quite willing to shame others less committed to his bizarre vision of Christianity. They are nothing more than cowards, he said. Christians are done being pushed around, and if secularists want war, it's war that they will get. Increasingly, he aligned himself with the likes of Roger Stone, Dinesh D'Souza, and right-winger Charlie Kirk. You may have heard those names. Charlie Kirk, a young person's movement, Turning Points or whatever it is, something like that, in order to secure his place as one of the evangelical church's most ardent Trump supporters. His group, or so-called church, grew by leaps and bounds, and eventually a massive tent on that hillside was put up that would seat 3,000 people. If we had 3,000 people here, Carol, I don't know where we would have them parked, do you? As Alberta says it, it would be the envy of Barnum and Bailey. Maybe it is, in fact, little more than a circus with serious consequences. In any event, Locke was certainly a showman, and he attracted other such, pardon the word, but he uses it, weirdos, to his Sunday revivals or circus shows. In attendance at one of his so-called revivals, Alberta reports that the preacher marveled at the massive turnout, likening it to a Billy Graham revival, and so on. I'm not sure Billy Graham would have wanted to go there. What was the fuel, Alberta asks, that drove Locke's rise to prominence? Big question mark. Social media. Social media. From one who had used the medium sparingly, Locke soon came to live on social media. From ranting and raving about kids being indoctrinated in schools to taunting the Republican governor of Tennessee from refusing to sign the bill that would make the Bible the official state book of Tennessee. As Donald Trump had weaponized Twitter, so Greg Locke weaponized Facebook against the so-called enemies of Christianity and the larger American culture. More and more people flocked to his so-called revivals online, but some also, Alberta says, drifted away in discomfort at the tactics he used. While his church in the early days had been established on the basis of radical compassion, it was now just radical. We could, at this point, write Greg Locke and his Global Vision Church off as a wingnut anomaly. Bizarre, but of not much consequence. But here is where Tim Alberta's discussion becomes most interesting for us, at least to me. While he had tried for a long time to interview Greg Locke, he had never received a response. But after several months, Alberta had visited one of his revivals. Several months after that visit, he got a call from Greg Locke. As he describes it, he had expected hubris and hostility from Greg. But what he got was skittishness, self-doubt, and some level of reflectivity. Interesting, huh? I could quote from Tim Alberta's book, but I'm not for the sake of time. Hearing all this, should we feel better about the Global Vision Bible Church? Alberta was not reassured that as bizarre as this is, it is not relatively harmless, folks, in the general religious landscape of 21st century America. And I ask the question, is this simply a strange mix of spiritual hyperbole run amok and reflective rationality all at the same time? That while misguided can simply be ignored because over time it will simply burn itself out? Well, maybe not. But Tim Alberta was not reassured. In fact, he felt worse after this interview about what he had seen. And he felt worse because Greg Locke, despite his serious side, had discovered there is a market for being irrational. Locke came to appreciate that wrath, we could substitute fear, is a business model. That crazy is a church growth strategy. That hating enemies is far more powerful, at least in the immediate sense, than loving them. We may also add that there is a market for lies and mindlessness, both religiously and, I would say, politically. And that can be put on steroids with mass media. From Alberta's point of view, rather than being curbed and brought into the mainstream evangelical fold, Locke made the evangelical fold surrender to him and his model for church growth and marketing. Well, there's more to be said here, folks. We're not going to get it done tonight, but I think you can see what I said at the outset. The kingdom builders, Jerry Falwell, Moral Majority, Lynchburg, Virginia. Now we've got Greg Locke, Global Vision Bible Church, and Juliet Mountain, Tennessee. Kingdom builders. And we're getting, through Alberta here, a kind of an insight into how, at least in one case, on this mountain in Tennessee, the whole thing can operate.
And so Alberta's next book will be, I think, that you mentioned 73, 74, 76, turning point in this dynamic.
Mm-hmm.
And that's exactly where the leadership of Project 25 began.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What did he say? I'm sorry.
David said that Tim Alberta's next book is going to deal with that time frame of early 70s, mid 70s, and the whole Project 25 effort has its roots in origins in that kind of mentality. I know many of you have to go, and that's fine. Julie gave me I don't know this guy, but she gave me a letter or opinion piece, maybe, I don't know, something like that, from a guy named Oliver Kornetsky. Does anybody recognize that name? And he came from a small town in Wisconsin, and he has lived in various parts of the world, educated and lived in various parts of the world, and he describes going back to his hometown. And one of the things I liked about this is he's not condemning the people in whose midst he grew up. He thinks they're pretty good people and they think well and they're critical thinkers. But they're trying to hang, he said it's like stepping into a diorama in a museum. They're trying to cling to a 1950s, early 60s view of American life. And then he reflects on his own. How he doesn't see living as a matter of surviving and indeed in some cases resisting, but embracing this change. And he thinks when we look back to the 1950s or early 60s prior to Vietnam, it all seems kind of glorious until you start to dissect it a bit. And does anybody really want to go back to that? But therein is the tension, and I think he's making this between urban and rural mindsets. And I do appreciate, again, as I say, he does not just beat these folks up. He said, many of them are good people, really good people. But it's a different world that we live in. Okay, I am going to put these back here. If anybody wants a copy, pick one up. This is the one on the Christian right is dead, the religious right killed it. And thank you for coming, and we'll pick this up next Wednesday, okay?